The Airbus A330 was cruising at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic when everything changed. In row 11, seat C, Lieutenant Colonel Evangeline Sketch Morrison was reading Adrienne Rich, her fingers tracing the words about women who had been erased from history. The irony wouldn't hit her until later. She had removed her Air Force dress blues jacket, folded it precisely in the overhead compartment, and was traveling in civilian clothes, a deliberate choice. After 16 years of service, she wanted anonymity. She wanted to disappear into the background noise of commercial aviation, just another passenger heading to London for what the manifest listed as personal leave. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom at 14:37 GMT, disrupting the ambient hum of engines and whispered conversations. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. We have an unusual situation developing, and I need to ask if there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft. Please press your call button immediately if you have fighter jet experience." Evangeline's hand froze above the page. Around her, passengers began murmuring, craning their necks to see if anyone would respond. She could feel the weight of her decision in the silence that followed. 3 rows ahead, a man in his 50s raised his hand, former Navy, by his bearing. 2 rows behind, another passenger stood up, speaking quietly to a flight attendant. But Evangeline remained still, her thumb marking her place in the poetry book. What none of the other passengers knew was that strapped to the aircraft's belly were 2 CF-18 Hornets, being transported to RAF Lakenheath as part of a routine NATO exercise. What they also didn't know was that 20 minutes earlier, the cargo hold's pressurization system had failed catastrophically. The Hornets' delicate avionics were now exposed to extreme temperature variations that could render them unflyable within hours. But there was something else, something that made the captain's announcement more than routine protocol. 40 miles off the coast of Scotland, a Russian Tupolev of Tu-95 Bear bomber had been shadowing commercial air routes for the past 6 hours, testing NATO response times. British and American intelligence had been tracking it, but their closest intercept aircraft were grounded due to mechanical issues at multiple bases across the UK. The coincidence was almost mathematical in its precision: a cargo failure, a probing enemy aircraft, and 247 civilian passengers suspended between earth and sky, unknowing participants in a chess match that could escalate beyond anyone's control. In row 11, Evangeline closed her book. The poetry would have to wait. Some erasures, she realized, were choices. The Boeing 777 carrying Russian diplomatic personnel had changed course 12 minutes earlier. British airspace was about to become very crowded, and everyone aboard Flight 447 was about to discover that sometimes heroes hide in plain sight, reading poetry in the middle seats of transcontinental flights, waiting for history to call their names. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat for the second announcement, and Evangeline Morrison finally pressed her call button. The small LED light seemed impossibly bright in the cabin's dim lighting. Around her, passengers turned to stare at the quiet woman in row 11 who had been invisible until this moment. She met their gazes steadily, her gray eyes reflecting something they couldn't quite identify: not fear, not excitement, but a kind of grim familiarity with moments when ordinary lives pivot toward the extraordinary. The flight attendant approached with practiced professionalism, but there was something in her expression that suggested this wasn't standard procedure. "Ma'am, the captain would like to speak with you immediately." Evangeline nodded, slipping the poetry book into her seat pocket. As she stood, her movements carried the subtle precision of someone accustomed to operating in 3 dimensions, someone who understood that altitude and attitude were often the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. Other passengers watched her walk toward the cockpit, nodding the way she moved, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the measured confidence of someone who had walked this particular path before. They had no idea they were watching one of the most decorated fighter pilots in Air Force history make her way to what would become either her finest hour or her final mission. The cockpit door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Captain Reynolds turned to face the woman who had responded to his unprecedented request. What he saw was not what he expected. Evangeline Morrison was 5'6" with prematurely silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a Cornell University sweatshirt. Nothing about her suggested the warrior she actually was, and that disconnect would prove to be more significant than anyone aboard Flight 447 could possibly imagine. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Reynolds. Thank you for responding. Can you tell me about your military experience?" His voice carried the strain of someone dealing with multiple simultaneous crises, but there was also relief, the relief of a civilian pilot who had just found a solution to an impossible problem. Lieutenant Colonel Evangeline Morrison, United States Air Force. 16 years active duty, F-16 and F-22 qualified. 2 combat tour in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, currently on leave pending retirement. She delivered the information without inflection, but Reynolds caught the subtle emphasis on currently. This woman was still active military, still bound by oath and obligation. "Colonel, we have a situation." Reynolds gestured toward the radio console, where static-filled communications were creating a tapestry of international tension. "We're carrying 2 CF-18s in our cargo hold for NATO transport. Pressurization failure means they might not be flyable when we land. British airspace is being probed by Russian aircraft, and our allies have no immediate intercept capability." Evangeline processed this information with the quick analytical skills that had kept her alive through 94 combat missions. The mathematics were brutal: compromised aircraft, hostile intentions, and civilian lives suspended in the balance. But there was something else, something in Reynolds' expression that suggested he hadn't told her everything. "Captain, what aren't you telling me?" she asked quietly. Outside the cockpit windows, the North Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath them, its surface appearing deceptively peaceful from 7 miles up. But Evangeline had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments often arrived disguised as routine. Reynolds exchanged glances with his co-pilot, then activated a secure communication channel. "Colonel, the Russian aircraft isn't just probing our defenses. Intelligence believes it's carrying electronic warfare equipment designed to disrupt NATO communications during a potential crisis. If they succeed, we could be looking at a complete breakdown of coordinated defense across Western Europe." The implications hit Evangeline immediately. This wasn't about 2 grounded fighter jets or even Russian posturing. This was about the delicate electronic networks that kept modern warfare from spiraling into chaos. And somehow, she and 247 innocent passengers had been placed at the center of a confrontation that could reshape international relations. "You need someone to fly one of those Hornets," she said, not asking a question but confirming what they all already knew. Reynolds nodded gravely. "The problem is, we don't know if they're even operational after the pressurization failure, and even if they are, launching from a commercial airliner at altitude." He trailed off, recognizing the impossibility of what he was suggesting. But Evangeline Morrison had built her career on impossibilities. She had flown missions that existed only in classified files, had made decisions in cockpits that would never appear in official records. The woman who had been reading poetry in row 11 was about to become the protagonist in a story that would redefine what courage looked like at 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from RAF Control. "Commercial Flight 447, be advised that hostile aircraft has altered course and is now on direct intercept trajectory with your position. Estimated contact in 47 minutes. We have no available assets for support." The transmission ended with a burst of static that seemed to emphasize the complete isolation of their situation. Evangeline looked out at the vast sky surrounding them and felt a familiar sensation, not fear, but the crystalline clarity that came when all pretense fell away and only essential action remained. She had spent 16 years preparing for moments like this, though she had never imagined one quite like this. In her pocket, the poetry book waited patiently, its pages filled with words about women who refused to be erased by history. She was about to write her own chapter. The cargo hold inspection revealed both hope and desperation in equal measure. The two CF-18 Hornets were secured in the belly of the Airbus, their sleek forms somehow both beautiful and ominous in the aircraft's fluorescent lighting. Chief Master Sergeant Torres, who had been traveling as a passenger escort for the fighters, ran his hands along the nearest aircraft's fuselage with the tenderness of a parent checking a child for fever. The pressurization failure happened fast, Torres explained to Evangeline as they crouched beside the lead Hornet. Temperature differential could have affected the avionics, but the structural integrity looked solid. These birds were built for punishment. His voice carried the affection of a man who had spent his career around combat aircraft, but also the professional concern of someone who understood that "look solid" wasn't the same as guaranteed operational. Evangeline ran her own inspection, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed countless pre-flight checks under less than ideal conditions. The Hornet's gray-blue camouflage scheme seemed almost organic in the cargo hold's artificial lighting, like some predatory creature waiting for release. She checked the external connections, the landing gear status, the weapons pylons, all empty for the ferry flight, but she noted their configuration automatically. Torres, what's your assessment of operational capability? She was already thinking like a mission commander, not a passenger on leave. The transformation was subtle but complete, shoulders squaring slightly, voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information. Ma'am, if I had to bet my life on it, which I guess we all are, I'd say 60% chance the lead bird is fully operational, maybe 40% on the wingman. Torres paused, studying Evangeline's face. But ma'am, with respect, launching from a commercial aircraft at altitude. That's not in any manual I've ever read. Above them, the Airbus continued its steady progress toward what was increasingly looking like an international incident. The Russian bomber was now 38 minutes from intercept, and NATO command was running out of options. In the passenger cabin, 247 people continued their conversations, watched movies, slept, unaware that their flight had become a chess piece in a game with stakes none of them had signed up for. Captain Reynolds' voice echoed through the cargo hold over the intercom. "Colonel Morrison, we're receiving updated intelligence. The Russian aircraft is definitely equipped for electronic warfare. If they successfully test their systems against our NATO frequencies, it could compromise defense communications for months while we develop countermeasures." Evangeline processed this information while continuing her inspection of the Hornet. The stakes had just escalated beyond a simple intercept mission. This was about maintaining the technological advantage that kept the balance of power stable. And that balance, she realized, now rested in the hands of a woman who had been reading poetry and planning her retirement 40 minutes earlier. "Torres, I need you to prep the lead bird for immediate launch. Full pre-flight, complete systems check. I want to know everything that's wrong with her before I strap in." She moved toward the aircraft with growing confidence, her civilian clothes now seeming like a costume she was ready to shed. "Ma'am," Torres said quietly, "you sure about this? Because once you're out there, you're alone. No wingman, no backup, no support. Just you and whatever's waiting in that sky." Evangeline paused, her hand on the Hornet's ladder. Through the cargo hold's small windows, she could see the endless expanse of ocean below, its surface painted gold by the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful and utterly indifferent to human conflict, a reminder that courage was always a choice made in the face of vast indifference. "Torres," she said, beginning to climb toward the cockpit, "I've been alone before." The Hornet's cockpit welcomed Evangeline like an old friend, extending an invitation to dance. Every switch, every display, every control surface was exactly where muscle memory expected it to be. The FA-18 was different from the F-16s, and F-22s she had flown in combat, but fighter aircraft spoke a universal language, and she was fluent in every dialect. Her hands moved across the instrument panel, with the fluid precision of a pianist returning to a familiar composition. "Systems coming online," she reported through the headset Tors had provided. "Engines are cold, but all preliminary checks are green. Navigation systems are initializing." Her voice carried the calm professionalism that had characterized her throughout 94 previous combat missions. But there was something else there too, a note of anticipation that had been missing from her flying for months. Tors stood on the cargo deck below, monitoring the power-up sequence through external indicators. "Ma'am, we're getting good readings down here. Whatever damage that pressurization failure might have caused, it doesn't look like it affected the primary systems." He paused, then added with the familiarity of a senior NCO speaking to a trusted officer, "You feeling good about this bird, Colonel?" Through the Hornet's heads-up display, Evangeline could see cascading streams of data as the aircraft's computers performed their startup routines. Everything was functioning within normal parameters, but normal parameters had nothing to do with launching from the cargo hold of a commercial airliner at flight altitude. That particular maneuver existed in a realm of physics and probability that no manufacturer had ever considered. "I'm feeling good about the bird," she replied. "It's the launch that's going to be interesting." She began calculating vectors and velocities in her head, trying to envision how the Hornet would behave when released from the Airbus's belly into the North Atlantic's thin air. The mathematics were complex but not impossible, difficult but not suicidal, probably. Captain Reynolds' voice crackled through the communication system. "Colonel, we're receiving real-time updates on the Russian position. They're maintaining course and speed, which suggests they're not aware of our unusual passenger complement. You'll have the element of surprise, but only initially." Evangeline acknowledged the transmission while continuing her pre-flight preparations. Surprise was a finite resource in aerial combat, something to be spent wisely and at the moment of maximum effectiveness. The Russian pilots would be professional, well-trained, and flying an aircraft optimized for electronic warfare rather than air-to-air combat. But they would also be expecting to encounter either no resistance or conventional NATO fighters operating from established bases with full support networks. They would not be expecting Lieutenant Colonel Evangeline Morrison, launching from a commercial flight with nothing but skill, experience, and a profound unwillingness to let civilian passengers become casualties in someone else's geopolitical chess game. "Tors, final systems check. I want you to verify everything one more time before we commit to this." She ran through the controls methodically, each switch and lever responding exactly as designed. The Hornet was ready for war, even if the circumstances of its deployment were unprecedented. Through the cargo hold's communication system, she could hear fragments of radio traffic from NATO Command, British Air Traffic Control, and various military installations across Western Europe. The professional calm in those voices couldn't entirely mask the underlying tension. Everyone knew they were operating without a playbook, making decisions based on incomplete information and hoping that courage would prove sufficient to bridge the gap between planning and reality. Above them, 247 passengers continued their flight toward London, most still unaware that their aircraft had become a makeshift aircraft carrier in international waters, or that their safety now depended on a woman who had been planning her retirement from military service less than an hour earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Evangeline as she completed her final preparations. She had spent 16 years learning to be invisible in a profession that demanded constant vigilance, to be competent without being threatening, to excel while making others comfortable with her excellence. And now, at the moment when she had finally decided to step away from that balancing act, she found herself in a situation where invisibility was no longer an option. The sky was calling, and Lieutenant Colonel Evangeline's sketch, Morrison, was ready to answer. The launch sequence began with a series of mechanical sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the Airbus's cargo hold. Chief Master Sergeant Tors worked with methodical precision, activating release mechanisms that had never been designed for aerial deployment. The Hornet shifted slightly on its restraining cradle, and Evangeline felt the subtle change in the aircraft's center of gravity through her connection to the flight controls. "Colonel, we're showing green lights across the board for release mechanisms," Tors reported through the communication system. "But ma'am, I have to emphasize that what we're about to attempt has never been tested. The stress loads on the Airbus, the aerodynamics of the Hornet's release, the power differential between the two aircraft, were operating completely outside known parameters." Evangeline acknowledged the information while running through her mental checklist one final time. The Hornet's engines were warm but not running. They would need to start in the moments immediately following release, which meant she would have perhaps 10 seconds of gliding flight before full power became available. Those 10 seconds would determine whether she joined the ranks of military aviation legends or became a cautionary tale studied in flight safety courses. Captain Reynolds' voice cut through the pre-launch tension. "Colonel, latest intelligence update. The Russian aircraft is now 22 minutes from intercept. They're maintaining radio silence, but satellite tracking shows they're definitely equipped with external electronic warfare pods. If they successfully test those systems against NATO communications, we're looking at a potential breakdown of coordinated defense across the entire European theater." The stakes continued to escalate with each passing minute, but Evangeline found herself settling into the familiar calm that preceded combat operations. This was the mental space she had occupied in the skis over Afghanistan and Iraq, a place where complexity reduced itself to essentials, where years of training distilled into instinct, where the difference between success and failure often came down to split-second decisions made with incomplete information. "Tors, initiate launch sequence on my mark," she commanded, her hands positioned on the engine start controls. Through the Hornet's canopy, she could see the curved interior of the Airbus's cargo hold, with its forest of support struts and tie-down points. In a few moments, that familiar environment would be replaced by the vast uncertainty of open sky. The release mechanism engaged with a sharp metallic clang that reverberated through both aircraft. Suddenly, the Hornet was falling through 7 miles of North Atlantic air, its nose pitched slightly downward as gravity took control. Evangeline had perhaps 3 seconds to assess the aircraft's attitude and stability before committing to engine start. The Hornet's flight characteristics were exactly as she remembered: solid, responsive, forgiving of pilot error within reasonable limits. But there was nothing reasonable about her current situation. Engine start was smooth and immediate, both turbofans spooling up to full power with the reassuring roar that meant the difference between controlled flight and uncontrolled descent. The Hornet's nose came up as thrust overcame gravity, and suddenly Evangeline was no longer falling but flying. No longer a passenger, but a pilot in command of one of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built. "Sketch 1 is airborne and operational," she transmitted, using the call sign that had followed her through 16 years of military service. "All systems green, engines normal, flight controls responsive. Beginning climb to intercept altitude." The response from NATO command was immediate and filled with barely contained relief. "Sketch 1, this is Allied command. Confirm you are airborne and operational from commercial aircraft. That's unprecedented. Outstanding work, Colonel." But Evangeline was already focused on the tactical situation developing ahead of her. The Russian bomber was still 17 minutes out, following a course that would bring it directly across commercial shipping lanes and civilian air routes. Her job was not just to intercept the aircraft, but to do so in a way that prevented any escalation while protecting the electronic warfare intelligence that NATO desperately needed. She climbed steadily through the thin air above the Atlantic, the Hornet's engines drinking fuel at a rate that would limit her operational time, but provide the power necessary for high-altitude intercept operations. Below her, the Airbus continued toward London with its 247 passengers, most still unaware of the drama playing out in the sky above them. At 39,000 feet, Evangeline leveled off and began her approach toward what would become either a textbook intercept or an international incident, with consequences none of them could predict. The radar contact appeared on Evangeline's display as a steady blip approaching from the northeast, exactly where intelligence had predicted the Russian bomber would be. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear was still 12 minutes from intercept, maintaining steady altitude and course with the confidence of an aircraft operating in what its crew believed to be undefended airspace. They had no idea that their carefully planned electronic warfare mission was about to encounter opposition from the most unlikely source imaginable. Sketch 1, Allied Command. Target is bearing 042 degrees, altitude 38,000 feet, speed 470 knots. We're tracking both the primary aircraft and what appear to be external electronic warfare pods. Recommend standard intercept procedures with extreme caution regarding escalation. Evangeline acknowledged the transmission while adjusting her approach angle. Standard intercept procedures called for positioning the fighter aircraft alongside the target, establishing visual contact, and using internationally recognized signals to communicate intentions. But nothing about this situation was standard, and she suspected the Russian crew's reaction to being intercepted by a single fighter aircraft appearing from nowhere would be anything but routine. The Bear grew larger in her heads-up display, its massive propeller-driven engines and swept wings unmistakable even at long range. It was an aircraft from another era of warfare, built for endurance and electronic intelligence gathering rather than speed or maneuverability. Against a modern fighter like the Hornet, it would be completely defenseless in aerial combat, but that wasn't the point of this encounter. The point was to demonstrate NATO's capability to respond to provocations, while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as aggressive first moves. Allied Command, Sketch 1 has visual contact with target aircraft, confirming Tu-95 Bear bomber with external pod configurations consistent with electronic warfare equipment. Beginning approach for standard intercept. Evangeline adjusted her throttles, bringing the Hornet's closure rate to a steady but non-threatening speed. Too fast, and the Russian crew might interpret her approach as an attack run. Too slow, and they might have time to complete whatever electronic intelligence gathering they had planned. The intercept maneuver required precision flying that left no margin for error. Evangeline positioned the Hornet approximately 200 meters off the Bear's starboard wing, matching the larger aircraft's speed and altitude with the kind of formation flying that looked effortless but demanded constant micro-adjustments in power and control inputs. Through her canopy, she could see the Russian aircraft's crew through their cockpit windows, professional aviators doing their jobs, just as she was doing hers. But there was something in their body language that suggested they were as surprised to see her as she had been to find herself in this situation. The Bear's pilot was clearly communicating with his crew and presumably with Russian command, trying to determine how a NATO fighter had appeared in what should have been empty airspace. Their electronic warfare mission had just become significantly more complicated. Sketch 1, Allied Command. Outstanding positioning. We're monitoring Russian military frequencies, and they're definitely reporting your presence. So far, no indication of hostile intent, but recommend maintaining current separation and monitoring for any changes in the target's flight profile. Evangeline held position alongside the Bear, her presence serving as a visible reminder that NATO airspace was defended even when conventional forces appeared unavailable. The electronic warfare pods mounted beneath the Russian aircraft remained inactive, their crew apparently unwilling to test their systems against NATO communications while under direct observation by a fighter aircraft of unknown origin and capability. Minutes passed in professional silence, two aircraft from different nations flying in perfect formation above the North Atlantic, their crews representing decades of training and experience in an encounter that would likely never appear in official records. The Bear's crew occasionally glanced toward the Hornet, acknowledging Evangeline's presence with the subtle nods that passed for diplomatic communication between military aviators. Then the Russian aircraft began a slow turn toward the northeast, away from NATO shipping lanes and back toward international airspace. The electronic warfare mission had been abandoned without a single system being activated, the mere presence of an intercepting fighter sufficient to demonstrate that the skies above Western Europe remained under vigilant protection. Allied Command, Sketch 1. Target aircraft is turning away from intercept course. Electronic warfare pods remain inactive. Mission appears successful. Evangeline maintained formation until the Bear had committed to its new heading, then began a slow separation maneuver that demonstrated her intentions were defensive rather than aggressive. The Russian pilot raised his hand in a gesture that was part salute, part acknowledgement of professional respect between aviators who understood the delicate balance between duty and diplomacy. Evangeline returned the gesture, recognizing in that moment the strange brotherhood that existed between military pilots regardless of nationality or political affiliation. As the Bear disappeared toward the horizon, Evangeline began her own turn back toward the Airbus, which was now approaching British airspace with its cargo of oblivious passengers. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew that the larger implications of what had just occurred would reverberate through military and intelligence communities on both sides of the Atlantic for months to come. A single fighter aircraft, launched from a commercial airliner by a pilot who had been planning her retirement, had just prevented what could have been a significant escalation in electronic warfare capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone monitoring the situation, but the effectiveness of the intervention was undeniable. Sketch 1, Allied Command. Outstanding work, Colonel. You've just completed one of the most unusual successful intercepts in NATO history. Recommend proceeding to RAF Lakenheath for debriefing and fuel. We have a lot of people who are very interested in hearing this story. But as Evangeline set course for the British coastline, she was already thinking about the bigger picture. This incident would raise questions about rapid response capabilities, about the readiness of NATO forces to deal with unconventional threats, about the role of individual initiative in crisis situations. And at the center of those discussions would be the story of a woman who had been reading poetry in row 11 when history called her name. The landing at RAF Lakenheath was surreal in its normality after the unprecedented events of the afternoon. Ground crews marshaled the Hornet to a parking area with the same professional efficiency they would apply to any arriving military aircraft. But Evangeline could see the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed her taxi to the flight line. Word of the commercial airliner launch had already spread through the base, and she suspected that what had begun as a routine ferry flight would become the subject of case studies and bar conversations for years to come. As she shut down the Hornet's engines, Evangeline felt the familiar post-flight mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that followed successful combat operations. But there was something else this time, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with mission accomplishment and everything to do with personal understanding. For 16 years, she had been proving herself in a profession that demanded constant vigilance against both external threats and internal doubt. Today, she had simply done what needed to be done, without hesitation or self-consciousness. The debriefing lasted for 3 hours and involved officers from NATO Command, British Intelligence, the U.S. Air Force, and several agencies whose acronyms Evangeline didn't recognize. They asked detailed questions about the launch procedure, the aircraft's performance, the intercept maneuver, and the Russian crew's reactions. But what seemed to fascinate them most was the decision-making process that had led a passenger on leave to volunteer for an unprecedented mission with no backup and no guarantee of success. Colonel Morrison, the NATO intelligence officer, said near the end of the session, "Your intervention today prevented what could have been a significant compromise of alliance communication security. The Russian electronic warfare systems they were testing could have provided them with months of intelligence advantage. Instead, they got nothing, and they know we have rapid response capability they weren't expecting." Evangeline nodded, but her thoughts were already moving beyond the immediate tactical success toward the larger implications of what had occurred. "Sir, with respect, I think today's events point to some gaps in our conventional response capabilities. If we hadn't been carrying those fighters as cargo, if TORS hadn't been aboard to prep the aircraft, if Captain Reynolds hadn't been willing to attempt something completely outside standard procedures, this could have ended very differently." The room fell silent as the assembled officers considered her assessment. She was right, and they all knew it. The successful intercept had been the result of an extraordinary series of coincidences rather than systematic planning or preparation. Against a more sophisticated threat, or in circumstances slightly different from those they had encountered, the outcome could have been disaster rather than triumph. "Colonel," the British liaison officer said quietly, "we'd like to offer you a position with our Joint Rapid Response Planning Committee. Your experience today, combined with your operational background, makes you uniquely qualified to help us develop protocols for unconventional threat scenarios." It was an attractive offer, and 6 months earlier, Evangeline would have accepted immediately. But something had changed during her 47 minutes in the Hornet's cockpit above the North Atlantic. She had rediscovered something about herself that had been gradually eroding during years of navigating institutional politics and career advancement strategies. "Thank you, sir, but I think I'm ready for that retirement I was planning." She smiled, and for the first time in the conversation, she felt completely relaxed. "But I'd be happy to consult on developing training scenarios based on today's events. I suspect there are lessons here that could benefit a lot of people." As the debriefing concluded, and the various officers dispersed to write their reports and brief their superiors, Evangeline found herself alone with Chief Master Sergeant TORS, who had flown to Lakenheath aboard the Airbus after its normal landing at Heathrow. They stood beside the Hornet, its gray-blue camouflage now seeming almost mundane under the fluorescent lights of the maintenance hangar. "Ma'am," TORS said, running his hand along the aircraft's fuselage, "I've been around fighters for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Launching from a commercial aircraft, intercepting a hostile contact, completing the mission, and bringing the bird home without so much as a scratch. That's going to be a story people tell for a very long time." Evangeline looked at the Hornet, remembering the moment when it had fallen away from the Airbus, and she had felt the familiar transition from passenger to pilot, from observer to participant. "TORS, you know what the strangest part was? For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how my actions would be perceived, or how they would affect my career, or whether I was living up to someone else's expectations. I was just flying." TORS nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent his career around aviators who lived for those moments of pure connection between human skill and mechanical capability. "Ma'am, sounds like you remembered why you started flying in the first place." As they walked away from the flight line, Evangeline pulled the poetry book from her pocket. She had somehow managed to keep it with her through the entire adventure. Opening it to the page where she had left off, she found the passage that had been interrupted by Captain Reynolds' announcement. "There must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors." She had always thought that line was about vulnerability and strength, about the courage required to be human in a profession that often demanded otherwise. But now she understood it differently. Sometimes being counted as a warrior meant accepting that the most important battles were the ones you never expected to fight, in circumstances you never could have imagined, with nothing but skill and determination bridging the gap between impossibility and necessity. The next morning, Newspapers across Europe carried headlines about the mysterious fighter intercept that had prevented a Russian intelligence gathering operation. But the full story, about the poetry-reading passenger who had volunteered for an unprecedented mission, remained classified, known only to the 247 passengers who had continued their flight to London and the military personnel who had been privileged to witness one of the most unusual combat operations in NATO history. Lieutenant Colonel Evangeline Sketch Morrison submitted her retirement paperwork the following week, but she also began working as a consultant for the Joint Rapid Response Planning Committee, helping to develop protocols that would ensure future unconventional threats could be met with more than coincidence and individual courage. Her recommendations would eventually influence NATO doctrine for decades, but that impact was still in the future. What mattered in the immediate aftermath was the letter she received from Captain Reynolds and the crew of Flight 447, thanking her for what they described as the most professional display of aviation skill and personal courage we have ever witnessed. It was signed by all the flight attendants, both pilots, and 47 passengers who had learned of her role in protecting their flight. But the letter that meant the most came from a 12-year-old girl named Rebecca, who had been traveling with her parents in Row 9. Rebecca had somehow obtained Evangeline's address through channels that remained mysterious, and her message was brief but profound. "Dear Colonel Morrison, my mom told me what you did for us. I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up. Thank you for showing me that heroes can be reading poetry in the middle seat and still save everyone when it matters." Evangeline kept that letter on her desk for the rest of her career, a reminder that the most important audiences for courage were often the ones you never knew were watching. 6 months later, at a NATO conference on unconventional threat response, a young RAF officer presented a case study titled The Lakenheath Incident: Lessons in Adaptive Response and Individual Initiative. The presentation was well received, but what generated the most discussion was the final slide, which featured a quote from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's after-action report. "Sometimes the most sophisticated defense system is a well-trained individual who refuses to accept that extraordinary circumstances require accepting defeat." The conference attendees spent the rest of the day discussing the implications of that philosophy, but none of them knew that its author was at that moment working in her garden in Colorado, occasionally glancing up at the sky and remembering what it felt like to own that vast blue territory, if only for 47 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon over the North Atlantic. Years passed, and the incident became part of military aviation folklore, the kind of story told in officer clubs and flight training schools as an example of what became possible when technical competence met moral courage in circumstances that no manual had ever anticipated. But for those who had been there, Torres, Reynolds, the intelligence officers, the NATO command personnel, it remained something more personal. A reminder that the most critical moments in military history were often decided by individuals who simply refused to accept that someone else's aggression should be allowed to succeed. The Russian aircraft that had been turned away that day never returned to test its electronic warfare systems against NATO communications. Intelligence analysts would later conclude that the unexpected appearance of an intercepting fighter had convinced Russian leadership that Western defensive capabilities were more robust and unpredictable than their planning had assumed. The operation that had been designed to probe for weaknesses had instead revealed strength in places where none was expected to exist. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the incident was the change it produced in NATO rapid response doctrine. The protocols developed by Evangeline and the Joint Planning Committee would eventually be credited with preventing 3 separate international crises over the following decade, each involving unconventional threats that required adaptive response rather than standard procedures. The poetry book that had been interrupted by history was eventually donated to the Air Force Academy Library, where it occupied a place,